we're not. There we go. All right, now we're on. I thought a minute ago that we were ready, but now we are. The green light's on. So we're continuing our discussion of the chapter on persuasion. We can kind of number these theories. That's just an artificial way of looking at them. We are in the fifth of the 5 theories. We began our discussion of the Yale Research Project and laid out the foundations for many generations of research there. We looked at social learning theory, which argued that we are engaged in self-persuasion as well as being influenced from the outside. We set goals to acquire information, to form attitudes, to decide on preferred modes of behavior. And out of all of this runs this very standard notion, which we simply call SEU, subjective expected utilities. That as human beings, what we're trying to do is to figure out what is rewarding, what is good, what we like, what we dislike, and become predictive then in our choices. That's what persuasion is all about. We talked about social judgment theory, which gives us a pretty good sense of how people can resist persuasion, because anytime a message that comes to me that is too far from what I want to believe, we said that contrast effects set in. I see greater distance between myself and that opinion than may actually be true, but I'm trying to reject it. That term also gives, or that theory also gives us insight into a concept that I think is on your review sheet called persuasibility. And I'm not sure that we have actually defined persuasibility, so I'd like to do that sort of early on today. I even have a little note to myself here to do that. If you remember us talking about the Yale the Yale learning theory, we argued that there are 2 dominant dimensions. No matter how many steps we break the persuasion process in, there are 2 dominant variables. One of them is yielding. One of them is receiving. I'm putting them in the order in which we would argue that they occur. One is receiving and the other is yielding. And so the term persuasibility is nothing more, but yet it is all of that, where we look to see what are the factors that increase or decrease. Persuasibility is nothing that. Increase or decrease the likelihood of reception and or the likelihood of yielding. Meaning, if you want to put it into the most simple lay term, it is the willingness to accept, the willingness to change, the willingness to give in, the willingness to be motivated. But persuasibility is always a persuadee, the target of the message if we're thinking of it as persuader, persuadee. That person's willingness to allow the message to influence them. Persuasibility. We know that persuasibility has many dimensions to it, one of which we talked about in terms of the involvement theory, ELM theory. I am more persuasible if I see my self-interest, my cognitive involvement aroused, because I'm more willing to go out and get information, and to the extent to which I think that information is likely to help me to come up with what I think to be a useful attitude, I am then likely to be persuasible. To the extent to which I don't, I am likely to have low persuasibility. So you see how we look at that. Before I launch into the 5th of the theories, let me pause for just a moment and see if you have any questions about any of the theories that we've talked about so far. How this all adds up, where this fits in terms of our understanding of that sort of dominant theme that runs throughout throughout communication theory called persuasion. Any questions? You're all happy? You know it all? It's all very clear? You understand it easily? Yeah.
Can you repeat your definition of persuasibility?
Simply, it's a measure of the willingness to receive and or to yield to a message.
Reception and yield.
Yeah, I think that both of those are there. Yep, the willingness to receive and or yield. Meaning that I can even receive it. That's what cognitive involvement theory would suggest, right? I'm willing to take the message in, but I'm not necessarily willing to yield to it because I don't think that, in my judgment, it's going to lead to something. And you see, and maybe I get it wrong, but I don't think so. What I like to do is to teach persuasion from this orientation, because it gives what I think to be not only a more accurate, preferred understanding of it, but it keeps us from getting into that bind where people believe that persuasion theory is inherently the means by which we learn how to manipulate people. And persuasibility suggests right from the top that people are variously persuasible. That, to me, is an important message to convey to communication students, because many times you may try to persuade people and find them to be very resistant. One of the good examples of that recently was Gray Davis. He found people resisting his message, oppose my recall. Another guy by the name of Schwarzenegger found people quite willing to be persuaded that his view of the future of California was preferred. And one can argue that it's ultimately the choice of the people, sitting there saying, do I hear something that seems to me the best under the circumstance to predict what my life will be like under either of these two options? Yes?
This is off topic from
That's
what
all right.
came up, but on page 173 you suggest that people feel cognitive discomfort when their behavior and attitudes don't coincide.
Right. What do you think?
Could that be like linked to the information theory that maybe people seek persuasion to alleviate the discomfort?
I think they often do. One of the things that we find then, and this gets us into something that we talk more about in other classes, is risk perception and risk calculations. If I have a dissonance between my action and my attitudes, the question is, do I change my action to conform to my attitudes, or do I change my attitude to conform to my action? Now, our old friend Darrell Bem said if you want to change people's attitudes, you first of all change their actions. We find a lot of that kind of circumstance, and there's a whole body of literature called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance literature grew up out of examining people who smoked at a time when there was an increasing body of literature that suggested that they ought not to smoke. So if I say smoking is bad for me, may be bad for me, but I'm a smoker, do I then change my attitude and say, well, I know at least one relative in my family who smoked and lived to be 110, so I can smoke. That's one way of creating an attitude that allows me to have agreement between my attitude and behavior. Or do I then try really hard to quit smoking so that my behavior conforms to my attitude? But there is that notion of discomfort. And I think it's also important that you point to that connection, because arguably in all of this literature, the very essence of what persuasion theory is all about is trying to bring that comfort between what we prefer and what we actually do. It also becomes something very relevant to marketing, because we like to create preferences. We're actually going to, in a moment, call those predispositions, on the assumption that if we create the right kinds of predispositions toward our product, we increase the likelihood that people will then behave in ways that conform to the attitude that they have formed. And arguably, that's the essence of what advertising is all about, is that we're trying to create the favorable attitude that predisposes the behavior, which ultimately we can say is arguably in the mutual interest of the seller and of the buyer. Now, people will get into that and talk about that in a lot of ways, and even the prospect of alienation getting in there. Because sometimes I can feel alienated if I am misled into thinking something about a product through advertising that may not be true. There is a whole body of literature, for instance, that talks about the consumer promise that is often implied or actually stated in an ad which the product itself cannot deliver on. And I go back to my that continued story of if I'm a very lonely person and I see an ad that says, if I drink bush beer, beautiful women will come out of the woods and sit on the log next to me. If I go out there and do that, to what extent is the advertising making a product claim that is not true? Is what predicts my popularity the beer that I drink or a whole lot more about me? See what I'm getting at? So there is that whole theme. And we know, and there is, I think in this chapter, some literature, maybe it's in the chapter on organization, that talks about people, typically if you poll them, they don't like advertising and they don't like the credibility of advertising. They don't think it's very credible. But what we do find is that people believe that the ads that they use to make their choices are very credible. And you can understand why based upon the very question that you asked. And that is that if I believe in a product, I don't like to believe that the advertising for that product is not credible. Because I want to use that information to confirm, reconfirm the behavior that I've got until I find one can argue a compelling reason to change. Does that make sense? Is that how all of this works together? Or did I lose everybody at some point in all of this? I did? I lost you? Where did I lose you? On day one when I said this is communication theory? All right. Day one, communication theory, and I have lost some of you at that point. Keep in mind that the orientation that I am trying to teach this from is the orientation of the individual. The individual is a decision maker no matter how bad or good we are at making decisions. That's what persuasion theory looks at, focuses on, because ultimately persuasion is using the knowledge about how people make decisions to seek to influence the decisions that they make. Now some of you say, but isn't persuasion really clever ways to manipulate people? And I say, well, you can call it that. I don't like to, because I think that that introduces a value judgment that distorts not only what we know and how we use it, etc., etc., etc. But it doesn't deny the fact that that value judgment can come in. So anyway, what we're doing in this chapter is exploring the dynamics of human decision making, which can be used for purposes of social influence in, and we'll talk about this later on, contexts such as interpersonal communication. Do you influence one another as you go through your daily activities? As people living and working and sharing space, do you find organizations influencing your behavior? Do you find the media influencing your opinions and behavior? What's also interesting is, we'll talk about this when we talk about the chapters on media, people's preferences influence the media. And we don't always think about that. But people's preferences will influence the media in terms of programming decisions and all this sort of thing, even advertising design, etc., etc. All right. Our fourth theory, which in my mind is sliced bread. This is it. This is the whole key to the whole thing, folks. This is the big kahuna. Now, a little bit on origin. Some of you tried really hard to either not know or forget about a concept that we discussed in the information chapter in the meaning chapter called semantic space. Remember that semantic space had two dimensions to it. Do you remember that? Oh, you just make my heart flutter. It had two dimensions. One was polarity, meaning on a scale of 1 to 9, 1 to 10, 1 to 40, whatever it made, you could have something over on one end saying good and on the other end saying bad. Keep in mind, right there, I've hinted at what an attitude is, isn't it? An attitude is a like or a dislike. We're going to see that in just a moment. As a matter of fact, on page 202, I'm going to direct your attention to what I think the best definition, preceding on 203, a mathematical formula. And I warned you to wear your mathematical formula glasses today so that when you see a mathematical formula, you don't immediately go into a mental breakdown. I know that it often happens with communication students. Okay, back to semantic space. Semantic space also indicated that in that space we have a variety of concepts or attributes that we associate with the object. Remember, we talked about grandmother. Our attitude toward grandmother is she bakes cookies, she's sweet and kind, and all of these kinds of things. And if I like my grandmother, then my polarity is over at the positive side. And if I dislike my grandmother, it's over at the negative side. See what I'm getting at? Now, I talked about people like Osgood, Susie, and Tannenbaum, most particularly Osgood. Osgood had a student called Fishbein. Fishbein had a student called Asian. And you can see all of these names in the references. And all I'm doing is putting together sort of a family tradition here. That at the University of Illinois, where Fishbein studied and learned under Osgood, he was very much aware of semantic space, and he said if semantic space works, if I can measure meaning, then I can pick all of that up, because isn't attitude nothing more than meaning? See why I place such an emphasis upon meaning early on? Isn't attitude nothing but meaning? And remember the other day I asked you, do words convey attitudes? And if so, we're interested in meaning and the measurement of meaning. Then can we translate that into something that allows us to better understand the nature of how meaning influences people's behavior? And you say, wow, that sounds exactly like sliced bread. That's the essence of this whole stuff. I would say you're absolutely right. Okay, we flipped the calendar forward. We've got Fishbein now working on his own, soon to take on one of his graduate students as a partner. And he comes up with the notion of the theory of information integration. Now, one of the parts of that is, and you can see his formula on 203, he's interested in the nature of attitude as a large A. And he asks us, what is an attitude? He actually tells us the answer to that, which if I were you, thinking that you might be asked that as an ID question on an exam, I would then try enormously hard to memorize the statement on 202 as a starting point. There it's defined as an attitude, a learned predisposition, positive or negative. See what we're getting into? Positive or negative. A predisposition is positive or negative. And we ask ourselves just surely intuitively, am I likely to want to do that which is positive? Am I likely to avoid that which is negative? Isn't that what we're really talking about? Learned predisposition to respond in a consistently favorable or unfavorable manner with respect to a given object. Well, when you look at his little formula on the other page, you see A sub O. You can also put A sub S, A sub B, meaning that I can have an attitude toward an object. Is that what advertising is all about? When you go to a shelf of goods and you look at the shelf, how do you choose which one you like? Isn't that predicted by your attitude toward the objects? Let's imagine that you go to the juice shelf. And some of you might pick orange juice. Some of you might pick grapefruit juice. Some of you might pick tomato juice. Some of you might pick cranberry juice. I like cran-raspberry juice. I also like orange juice. If there were something called strawberry juice, don't count on me to pick it. I don't like strawberry. But strawberry, let's go talk about ice cream. I actually talk about ice cream later on. You see, persuasion has to do with ice cream. How much of a better deal can you have? So I'm over there. First of all, I have to decide between 3 or 4 or 5 brands. And the store has carefully put them out so I can make that choice. I'm likely to hone in on Bluebell. Now, if I can, there is a Bluebell flavor which I'm told by having gone through the Bluebell factory is seasonal. Because it has chocolate and cherry. If I could just figure out how to get peanut butter in there, I would be totally addicted and eat nothing but that my entire lifetime. But I love it. I don't even know what it's called, but I would. There it is. Oh, see, my Cupid fan shows it. What? That's seasonal. Doesn't that break your heart? Breaks my heart, because that's what I want. But now I will settle for vanilla, particularly if I can put ample amounts of chocolate on it. And am I heartbroken when I see a chocolate syrup company advertising genuine chocolate flavor? I ask you for your essay question for the semester, explain that one to me. What is genuine chocolate flavor? Probably the only thing in there that's genuine is the flavor. And how do they just get genuine chocolate flavor? Do they extract the flavor out of chocolate, throw the rest of the stuff away, do something else with it, and then feed us plastic? Is that what chocolate is? Well, if you talk to the people in Holland and Germany and Norway, they think we eat plastic and call it chocolate over here. They don't think we drink good beer. They don't think we eat good chocolate. And I'll tell you, they also don't think we elect very smart presidents, but I didn't want to bring that up. Okay. AO, attitude toward an object, attitude toward a situation. Okie dokie, particularly for those that will see this at some point on VHS or some other medium. Today we have rain in Houston. Is my attitude toward rain attitude toward a situation? I'm going to get wet, and my drops are going to fall on my head, and my shoes are going to get wet, and he's not going to talk about anything of interest, so I'm going to use my attitude to predict my behavior, and that is I've now justified staying at home. I wanted to stay at home anyway, but now I've got a perfectly good attitude toward the situation. Now, with students, and see, I've been at this too long, if the day is really pretty, they have an attitude, why would you go to class on a pretty day? Is attitude toward class, or this class, is that something that we can measure? Can I measure your attitude toward this class? I won't do that. Not now anyway. It would scare me to death. What is this crazy guy doing? Right? But I can measure that. How about attitude toward behavior? The argument is that I can have preferences, predisposing preferences about anything that I can experience, any choice that I might have to make. And that, I think, is the essence of information integration at the starting point. So we've got something called an attitude. Now, if you look at the little formula on the other page, just do this with one eye, those of you that are mathematic challenged, you will notice a little B over there. Attitude is the sigma sum of all of my beliefs times my evaluations. Oh, where are we going with all this? Well, first of all, what's a belief? If you look further on that same page, you will come down to the very last paragraph. It says, a belief is the cognitive dimension of an attitude that expresses the extent. Don't you hate words like that? Subjective probability to which an evaluation, positive or negative, is associated with an object, concept, situation, action being evaluated. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, let's take our good friend Arnold Schwarzenegger. On a scale of 0 to 100, oh my gosh, that sounds to me now like we're back in information theory. Remember when I talked about the degree of certainty we have something? Oh, I wanted to forget everything that I'd had to learn up to this point. And now he's making me think of it again. Certainty, the degree to which something is certain. Arnold is a bodybuilder, okay? High certainty on that, right? Do you think being a bodybuilder is a positive or a negative evaluation to being a governor? I actually think the people in California thought that a strong, dominant guy with a strange accent probably was a positive. But then that accounts more for California than it does for us. Would a bodybuilder? I'm just teasing. It worked in Minnesota. Jesse the Body Ventura. Now we've got Arnold the Body Schwarzenegger. So maybe there is something about that. But what about his position on a variety of issues? I believe that he can roll back the car tax. I believe that he can protect education without raising my taxes, meaning that we're talking about a degree of certainty. Okay, now we're back in our ice cream parlor, aren't we? We're back at the ice cream cabinet. I believe that anything with cherries in it is very good. A belief is a subjective probability that a concept, a trait, an attribute goes with an object. To what extent is ice cream good? on a scale of 0 to 100%. 1 to 8, 1 to 7, 1 to 5, I don't care. We can measure that, can't we? This is one of the reasons that information integration is so important, is that we can measure all of this. We can boil it down to a mathematical formula, and that allows us a lot of research and or applied use of this for advertising, for political communication, for public relations, for measuring people's reaction to my television program, my magazine, my website, all of that sort of thing. Belief is simply a subjective probability. If you wrote that down on an essay ID, I would say that's pretty good. Subjective probability that an evaluation goes with an object or something like that. An evaluation is simply a positive or a negative. That's all it is. Evaluation, positive or negative. Now, an attitude then is the sum of all of my beliefs, what are the attributes that go with this thing, and all the evaluations that are associated, positive or negative. I can scale that, I can create a mathematical formula, I can test it, and Fishbein has done that over and over again. Now, you say, but wait a minute, you talked about information integration. What does that mean? It means that often my attitudes are a product of both positives and negatives. Oh, that screws my head up. How about you? What do you mean positives and negatives? Well, let's think about ice cream. Why not? It's lunchtime. I'm going through Brenham today. I may stop and see if chocolate and cherries is in season. Now, when I do that, when I think about that, what can we say about ice cream? Is it tasty? Is it sweet? Does it deliver to us a variety of flavors? Is it cool? Do we like the texture? All of those things we could argue are positives, right? But what is ice cream? I hate to tell you, it ain't nothing but animal fat, sugar, and flavoring. I ruined your day, haven't I? A great glob of animal fat slapped on your plate, you wouldn't eat, but if I put enough sugar in it, you probably would. Well, some of the sugar is natural, some of the sugar is added. Animal fat and sugar. Now, if we have a predisposition to not like animal fat, we might even be motivated then to go to light ice cream, but like light beer. Why take out most of the fun just so that you look good? Isn't the whole object not to look good? Isn't that where we're really, I'm just teasing. Just teasing, right? Well, information integration means that we often have a mix of positive and negative evaluations about things. If I asked you about your car, is it all either positive or negative? No. But probably, although I'm sure in some of your cases the negative is now beginning to outweigh the positive, which can predict that you're about to get rid of it, right? When it gets to the point that you've got more negative attitudes towards your car than your positive attitudes, you're likely to get rid of it. And when you drive that car out for the first time, out of the showroom, aren't you predisposed to think of everything positive that you possibly can about it? Because you just spent a lot of money. But over a period of time, every little thing that goes wrong can, but it is the whole. What about people? Does this account for your friends? Are you either like or dislike your friends, or do you kind of like your friends? Or do you like friends because they have certain attributes in some cases and not too many of the bad attributes in those cases and so forth, meaning that I think one of the great blessings of this theory is that it allows us to segment our attitudes so that we can see the competing balance of positives and negatives. The argument is that if we're going to have the sum of, that's what an attitude is a sum of the beliefs and the evaluations, then the beliefs evaluations, the positives and the negatives, strongly or weakly held, have got to add up to the positive side if we have a positive attitude, add up to the negative side if we have a negative attitude. Well, let's then just go back and try to redefine attitude again. One definition of attitude is what I just read a while ago. Another definition of attitude is that formula. Isn't that what an attitude really is, that formula? People have come to me and said, if I just write that formula down, will you give me full credit? Isn't that what that is? Isn't that a definition of an attitude? See, wouldn't I give you full credit? It would even help if you told me what it meant, but because I figure that some of you could write it down and not have any idea what it meant. But then how about this even for the simplest, and that is likes and dislikes. An attitude is a like or a dislike. Now you say you're talking our language. Well, see, what I'm trying to do is to say there's a very sophisticated kind of a language, but it sort of comes down to likes or dislikes. Okay. Well, we've beat that horse a lot. Now let's turn the page and see how all of this works. On page 204, we come to something. Oh, I never did get up my Theory 5 slide, integration, theory of reasoned action and so forth. Information integration not to be. See if we can get that up. It'll come up sooner or later. It's a long one. I ought to go out for lunch while you write that down. It'll come up sooner or later. Anyway, okay. Now let's imagine us making a choice. We're back in the department store, or let's even imagine that we're going out buying a car. One of the themes that comes out of this theory is that we're sort of like little computers. Do you like that metaphor for who you are, little computers, that you're calculating positives and negatives, and you're walking around your whole life calculating positives and negatives, however good or bad that you are, that's what you're doing, positives and negatives, so you're going out and buying a new car. On page 204, we can imagine that we've gone out and looked at cars, several of them now, and by looking at whether the car is reliable, economical, large enough for a family of 5, whether it's comfortable, whether it's easy or hard to service, and whether it's stylish, we can then begin to predict what the attributes are that people might want to associate. And the attributes are shown on page 204. Are those reasonable attributes about a car? Is it a reliable automobile? Is it an economical automobile? Is it a small or large automobile? Is it a comfortable or an uncomfortable? Is it an uncomfortable or a comfortable automobile? Is it hard or easy to service? Is it stylish or not stylish? Isn't that sort of okay? That's kind of how people think. So we got a family of 5. Mom and Dad and 3 big teenagers. So we don't want a little car because then we'll be all smushed in. We got to have a bigger car. See, it's got to be an attitude that fits the behavior that we want. My wife and I have a daughter, a son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. And those of you that know anything about grandchildren, nowadays, it used to be you could smush children up in the corner of a car and that'd be okay. Now you've got them in child seats that are every bit as big as an adult my size. They take up a lot of room. So we got to have a 6-passenger car. Go out and find a 6-passenger car. They're not all that easy out there anymore because everybody figured nobody had 6 people. You can get a van. My wife, I think, would rather be stabbed in the heart with a blunt instrument than drive a van. She said, how about a Suburban? I would rather be stabbed in the heart with a blunt instrument than to buy a Suburban, because I've said so many bad things about Suburban drivers over the years. So there we are. We're stuck, right? But we got to make a decision. And the decision to not make a decision is a decision. So there we go. Okay, I don't think we've ever got the slide up, but we'll keep working on the prospect that it will come up at some point. All right, now, we've looked at brand A and the sum, and you can see at the bottom of page 204 where we come to a little sum down there. That sum is A equals the sum of B times E. That's all it is. You can even see that here in this model. B, those are the beliefs. We calculate them in percentages. E, positive 3, extreme on one end, negative 3, extreme on the other end. That gives us a 7-point scale, doesn't it? 3, 2, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 7-point scale. See how it all works? Isn't this nifty? Sliced bread, folks. Sliced bread. Okay. Brand A, the little calculator kicks in. They say it comes up at a 1.35. Brand B comes up at a 1.87. Brand C comes up at a 2.12. And then they go in and they look at brand X. And they look at brand X and they look at brand X and they think that it's reasonably reliable. It gives them a 0.75. And reliability is a very high evaluation that they want. They want a car that's reliable. Doesn't that make sense? You ever go in and say, I really want an unreliable car? So to want a reliable car makes sense. 0.70 on economical. Do they want an economical car? You betcha. Now see, not everybody wants an economical car. There are people out there driving cars that get very bad gas mileage. But that's okay because they have an identity issue. And that's fine. And the environmentalists are out there screaming at them, and sometimes the eco-terrorists are knocking out their back windows. So it's a brutal battlefield over economical. Small, remember this is a family that's had lots of potatoes. They look at this particular car, brand X, they say it's too small, and they believe that strongly, 0.99, and a small car is a -3. That's a pretty strong attribute affecting their decision. It looks to me like it's going to be uncomfortable, particularly if we decide to go see Aunt Maud up in Vermont, and we're going to be stuck in this thing together for a long time. Hard to service, we make a calculation like that, and stylish, had to throw something like that in. This is a family that doesn't care about style. Now, I'm talking to people that have never seen the movie. Wally World, Chevy Chase, remember that car? That's what we're thinking about here, right? Maybe it's a big car but not very stylish. Would you accept that car, or does style count for much? Now you see what happens in here is maybe style is all that counts. I couldn't care about service. Uncomfortable, there is only me. I wouldn't care less. Now I'm beginning to think about Crossfire again. This little car that's just big enough for me and my wife. I can hear it now, but it can't haul the grandkids in it. I'm not even sure I can haul my suitcase in it. But there it is. It's out there. Wouldn't I really want that? To see what I'm getting at? I have a sense of what I want the world to deliver to me. Will this product do it? And I calculate that. Now, remember I talked about brand A, 1.35, brand B, 1.87, brand C, 2.12, and brand X, minus 2.24. What's the likelihood that this family is going to buy brand X? Comparison to the others, 0, right? Which one are they most likely to buy? Brand C, 2.12. Now you say, oh, come on, it doesn't work that way. You want to bet? Go talk to the marketing people. They'll tell you it does, right? You believe this? You think this theory works? Does it make predictions of that kind? You're not convinced? I have not persuaded you to have a positive attitude toward information integration. Well, let's keep going anyway. Persistence counts in teaching. Because one of the next questions I know you would ask, because I know who you are, you're very, very clever and insightful people, you would say, but where in the world do we get these evaluations? It's a pretty good question. Ties in to some things that we talked about before. Let's look over on page 206. Remember when I talked about modeling? Modeling? What did we talk about modeling? I watch other people and I see what works for them, and I use their success or failure as a way of deciding what works for me. Who's likely to influence the criteria that you use in buying an automobile? Who's likely to do that? Would your spouse be influential on you? Could be. How about a respected friend? How about a respected coworker? What about the salesperson? We like to believe we don't trust them. The oldest boy in the family, he wants something that he can imagine going to the prom in with only one other person. He could care less whether you could get more people than that in that car. And the oldest girl, she's interested in how it looks when she drives into the shopping mall. Well, I'm just teasing. Lest you revolt. Yes? Well, could be. I didn't want to go down that road. You opened the door. We could. Okay, yes. All right. Now, the question that we often ask ourselves is, to what extent does my behavior reflect what I think significant others would like for me to do, coupled to my motivation to comply with them? Does that make sense? You bet. I could probably say it 10 more times. Whether I get it right every time or not, I never know, right? Okay. What is likely to predict what you do? What you think other people would want you to do? Coupled with your motivation to comply. Somebody you really don't like suggests, why don't you do this? What's the likelihood that person would be influential over what you do?
Depends on who the person is.
You don't like them. Wouldn't do it. Your very best friend says, let's do this. Motivation to comply. Higher, right? Now we're beginning to lay a foundation for interpersonal communication. Why do we like to share the attitudes of our friends? Because it's a way of seeing the world together, behaving in similar ways. Don't you like to be like them? Don't you like to have the same preferences? If you are a person who likes the Grateful Dead, don't you expect all of your friends to like the Grateful Dead, wear tie-dye? If you're a biker out there, a Harley guy, Harley lady, don't you expect everybody to be like that, right? And if somebody said, I hate Harley riders and I hate Harleys, what would you have as an attitude toward them? Could be at least neutral, could be dislike, could whatever, right? So, to some extent, one of the most telling questions that Fishbein and Asian asked in their theory of reasoned discourse was, how do we formulate these attitudes? And part of it was because of what we think other people think and our motivation to comply with them. Now, we can carry that all the way back to social learning, can't we? How do I get my attitudes? How do I get my attitude toward ice cream? By direct experience, by getting information, by modeling, by role-playing. Imagining myself driving this, I can even go out and I can test ride it, can't I? Test drive it. So my motivation to comply will predict what my predisposition is in this regard, and then, oh my gosh, we come back now to one additional mathematical formula in here, because you've got one on page, I'll get it here. You've got one on 203, you've got another one, Sn equals the sum of the normative beliefs times the motivation to comply on 206, and then later on you've got BI, behavioral intention, equals the attitude toward the object times my subjective norm. My subjective norm is the likelihood that I think significant others would prefer one kind of action as opposed to another kind of action. Okay. Theory of reasoned action. Integrated theory of information integration. Works on the assumption that mathematically we can break this down, we can see the component parts, we can measure them and see them working together in some arithmetical form to predict what people will actually do. And I will imagine in marketing this has been influential. I know in advertising it has, and in a lot of other ways this is the stuff. This is it. Now, let me stop for a few minutes. I want to finish the chapter today, including talking about interpersonal communication and persuasion, organizational communication and mass media. But let me stop at least and ask whether you kind of understand a little bit here and there what I've been talking about? Theory of integrated information integration.
I have a question.
Okay.
On the test, do we have to explain these formulas to you?
No.
Or it's just
But if you did, wouldn't that make me flutter? Wouldn't my
think-
heart flutter? And one of the deals in life is when you make my heart flutter, I make your heart flutter, right? Okay? Yes.
I'm not sure I understand the intended behavior, because if your attitude is negative and the subjective norm is negative, wouldn't that come
Then
out
you-
with a positive?
Well, I would say that in a sense mathematically it could, if you looked at it that way. If you multiply a negative times a negative, it becomes a positive, right? But in a realistic sense, we know that if I have a negative, well, I don't know what that would do. Let's conceptually think that through. What would that do? If I have a negative attitude, I guess I would say that maybe what that would be, that's almost like a stalemate, isn't it? But what
Maybe
you're
it
arguing is that the
reinforces
product
your
should become a positive. A negative times a negative should become a positive.
Maybe that reinforces your attitude. The intended behavior reinforces your attitude.
Could be. It could be. Let's see. Okay, I have a negative attitude toward buying ice cream. I don't want to buy it. And I have friends that tell me, don't buy it. So the answer then would be that I should not buy it. And your argument is that mathematically it would be the exact opposite, right? We'll have to think about that. I think you've asked a very good question there, and I'm not mathematically or conceptually astute enough to know the answer now. But the way it's supposed to work out is that if I have a negative attitude towards something, and I have a positive desire to conform to that, then I should not do it. Right, yeah.
I don't think that the positive, negative mean the same thing mathematically as they do in these theories. Like, you can't assign a numerical value positive or negative on this. I don't think so.
You don't think you can assign it at all, or you think that I haven't figured out the mathematical answer to her question?
Well, I don't think you can't.
I feel obliged to try to figure out the mathematical answer, and I don't know whether you're just helping me to get off the hook or you have another answer.
Well, I don't think you can apply a negative number value to these equations and make them work. I think you can use positive numbers to do that and get a good result that
You
works.
do run into that problem, and we had to be very careful when we put together our formula over here because of the magic of multiplying anything times a zero. But it's conceptual that I can at some point multiply things times a zero and have no attitude or no motivation to comply, and that's a conceptually reasonable explanation of human behavior, isn't it? To be right in the middle and not have a preference one way or the other. And if you don't believe that, just listen to people over the next week. I don't care. I don't care can be a perfectly good attitude, couldn't it? Now, whether they really care or not is another thing, but they may say that, yeah.
You said that the second part to what you just said was that they feel negative to comply. Do they mean to comply to their attitude or to somebody else telling them to not to do it?
It's the perception of what I think the significant others in my life would want me to do. We know that, for instance, peers can be very influential to adolescents. Is that right? So to what extent do I take on an attitude that I adopt because of my motivation to comply with my peers? Co-workers, the same way. In a sense, now what we're doing is talking about how this applies in interpersonal or a work situation. If I go to work for Walmart, am I not predisposed to believe that Walmart is good, et cetera, and in organizational communication? Am I not, if I'm a professional communicator working for them internally to work with employees, trying to convince the employees it's a good place to work? Whether I succeed or not is another matter, which then takes us into the quandary of persuasion. it doesn't always succeed because sometimes we're not right or we're not dealing with people from where they're coming from. Is that the way to explain that? But did that answer your question? Or did I just waltz?
You also said before that if you have a negative attitude about something and your friends tell you not to do that, before, did you say that then you're...
My prediction would be that you wouldn't do it. Right? That you wouldn't do it. What would you think? Is that intuitively what you would predict? Wouldn't do it. Does that fit then? Okay. Is that right? Yes.
I think oftentimes in social interaction, whenever you go to your friends for approval, most of the time you're only looking for their approval, and if they say something against it, if you've already set your mind, you just dismiss
you're really
it.
looking for affirmation, aren't you? But it is nice to know that you can at least find affirmation. And predictably, isn't that one of the things that we do in interpersonal communication, is sort of prejudge what we think our friend is going to want us to say? Somebody comes to you and say, do you like this? Whatever it might be. You like my new car, you like this, that, and the other thing. Do you really want to be honest? If they really like it? Do you really want to be brutally honest?
It depends on which friend you're talking about.
Could be, but it's got to be a really good friend if they're willing to take brutal honesty, right? Because I've told the truth to good friends and found that they're not as good a friend after the case because they didn't want that much honesty. Is that fair? But I think you're into exactly where we're going with this in another sense, and that is to predict the nature of interpersonal relationship, and that is that in interpersonal relationship, we want to associate with people based upon the production of positives and the avoidance of negatives. So we present ourselves to one another as being somebody that's more desirable than undesirable. We can even predict in terms of communication. Now I can't think of it. I will in a minute, maybe, I hope so. Communication accommodation theory, that I may, if I want to be seen as positive, I may even take on your behavioral mannerism. If you and I are interviewing, I have a job and you're a person who wants the job, and I lean and I do things, to what extent after a few minutes might you take on exactly the same mannerisms that I have?
Well, fairly good. It's the same as like any sort of social interaction, someone you're trying to impress romantically, you do mimicking. So.
Yeah, and that fits this whole thing, doesn't it? See how it works? I mean, what I'm getting at, it really does work. Although I can't explain it mathematically, when you put it to me in those terms, I know that it really works. And that's where we're going in a sense, because one of the themes that we're going to address when we get into interpersonal communication is to what extent is interpersonal communication and relationship building really persuasion, where I'm trying to persuade you to be my friend, persuade you that I should be your friend. Is that a fair way of looking at it? So I act in certain ways so that I can convince you, and put it into the romantic context, and it even becomes more obvious and or more deceitful. Because for some period of time I can pretend to be somebody that I'm really not, and then announce to you later on that, well, here's who I really am. That can be a problem. Well, we're going to talk about trust when we get into interpersonal communication. We'll do that on Tuesday of next week. Well, let's talk a little bit about interpersonal communication right now, because some of that fits in here as well. In interpersonal communication, how does persuasion work? Well, one of the things that we can tuck in here is the notion that part of interpersonal communication has to do with compliance gaining. There's a whole literature on compliance gaining, and let's see how that might work. On page 208, and I think it fits the analysis that our colleague just brought up back there. A couple of researchers, this is in the middle paragraph on page 208 by the name of Marwell and Schmidt, argued that in interpersonal communication, we can also see this applying to organizational communication. We'll postpone that observation for a while. In interpersonal communication, there are arguably 16 compliance gaining strategies that we use. Let's look at some of these strategies. What is a compliance gaining strategy? It is a strategy used to get you to agree or to go along with me. So that's how this works. Let's see what their list entails. If we come down about the middle of that paragraph, the first one we might say is positive self-feeling. Let's go to the movie tonight. You'll have a really good time. Is that positive self-feeling? I want you to go to the movie, but I tell you that going to the movie will be a good time. You'll have a good time. It's a great movie. I understand that Mystic Something is supposed to be a great dark movie, right? So I might say, let's go to that movie because it'll be scary and dark and gloomy, and I know you're the kind of person that likes that. Okay? Now, let's see what else is down there. A negative self-feeling. If you don't do this, you're going to feel real bad about yourself. If you don't go out with me, you're going to be sorry. Little kids do that. Be my friend or you're going to be sorry. First of all, I'm not going to like you. And second, I'm going to poke you. Hit you in the nose. Positive alter casting. Oh, I've even got some others above that. How about compliance gaining based upon liking? Do children do this? Do this because you like me? Do this because I like you. We're good friends. Let me play with your toy. Do kids do that? Adults do that as well, don't they? We just don't like to admit it. Debt. You owe me. Do this for me. On your way to work in the morning, come by and pick me up. I'm 92 miles out of your way, but do that because remember the time that I came by and picked you up? Debt. Moral appeal. It's the right thing to do. Pre-giving. Beware the coworker who shows up with donuts because the person is going to use debt. Work for me, cover for me from 2 to 3 this afternoon. Remember, I brought donuts. Pre-giving. I give you something on the assumption that I create debt and obligation, so you have to give me something back. Aversive stimulation, a request that promises to discontinue punishment. I will send you to your room until you learn to behave. This will hurt you. This will hurt me more than you. No kid ever believed that. And so forth down the line. All of these. Now, the notion is that there is a list of these compliance gaining strategies. And I think it's good to think about them because they do actually operate. What Marwell and Schmidt did was to look around in their experience and said, it seems that this kind of stuff goes on. Then the question is whether people actually use these and use these in any kind of a systematic way. And I'm not going to bog you down in this class with what follows Marwell and Schmidt because there are several pages afterward where people argued what are these compliance gaining, which ones do we use, etc., etc., etc. For instance, and this sort of tied into the point that he was making back there, it can be the test of a relationship which of these are legitimately used and which of these are not. Isn't that fair to say? That one of the tests of a relationship is which of these do we actually use? We're going to talk later on about a theory of interpersonal communications called social exchange. Part of social exchange is whether I think you are worth being my friend. Do you cost more as a friend than you give in exchange? So that if you constantly use compliance-gaining strategies where I appear to be beholding to you and obligated to you, after a while I may see that as control and not a pleasant ingredient in our relationship. You see what I'm getting at? You don't? I thought I was being incredibly clear. Thought it all made sense. Pre-giving. If I show up every day and say, here's the donut, now you've got to do something for me, after a while don't you kind of get, oh, maybe you're not that good of a friend, you're always putting me into obligation that I don't necessarily want to be. In debt. At what point in my life am I no longer in debt to you? You gave me a ride once, I've given you a ride 300 times, quit calling. See what I'm getting at? Is that how we use these can be dependent upon the nature of the relationship. We could even imagine that earlier in dating behavior, some of these are appropriate or inappropriate, and they become variously appropriate or inappropriate as time goes on. They can change. My wife and I have been married forever. Light, then marriage, then us, right? 38 years. We have negotiated a lot of these kinds of things. Pre-giving doesn't count for very much. We're in way too much debt to each other. Do this because. Do this because it'll make you feel good. Now it's even worse. Do this because it's in the name of the grandkids. That's intimidating, isn't it? Anything can be done in the name of the grandkids. Well, the notion is that we use compliance-gaining strategies. What are they? When do we use them? Why do we use them? And ultimately, one of the questions that we get into is, do these compliance-gaining strategies increase or decrease the quality of the relationship? So, in a sense, I've talked about compliance theory, and I've also previewed where we're going sometime in the next several days of class together in interpersonal communication theory and social exchange. Social exchange treats us as little computers where we calculate whether people are worth the cost of the relationship. Do they add to the relationship more than they work against the relationship? And part of the prediction of whether we like them or not, using our old friend Fishbein's model of theory of integrated information integration, is that every once in a while I recalculate to see whether you're a positive or a negative in my mind. And I can tire of you. Even a parent can tire of their child. Now tomorrow I'll love you again, but right now I don't. And it becomes even worse in adolescence, doesn't it? Because we spend our time at one another. We're always, see what I'm getting at? Is how this sort of works. Organizational communication theory. Does compliance-gaining theory work in organizational contexts? All over the place. Does it predict sales? Very well may. I give you a discount, and out of that I get back some kind of sales of the product that I'm trying to sell to you. We also know that organizational culture can be predictive of positive or negative attitudes. And when we get into organizational communication in the last unit of the class, I'll even show you what it's like to be in various organizations with some film clips. I have some on interviewing to sort of suggest how when you interview, you get some sense of what the organization is going to be like to work for, meaning that you have some predisposed attitude. It'll be a good place to work. What if I get there and find out that it's not a good place to work, and I don't like it because the culture there is not a culture that's comfortable to me? Am I going to be happy? Am I going to have a predisposition to leave the first time that I can? So arguably one of the rationale for organizational communication is to create an organization where people want to work. You're persuading them that this is a good place to work. We'll talk about that later on. It also gets into superior-subordinate relationships, doesn't it? Boss trying to get you to do something, you trying to get the boss to do something. We can even talk about negotiation, etc., as a part of persuasion. Finally, mass-mediated communication. One can argue that mass-mediated communication is brought to you by the power of persuasion. Is that a reasonable conclusion to make? Tell me more. Go ahead. Advertising.
Yeah, most of it's paid for
Advertising.
with advertising.
If somebody out there didn't think they could sell you a product while you're watching Cupid, oh, my Cupid person's gone now. Right? So television is brought to you on the prospect. Now, to what extent does the repeated exposure to certain lifestyle messages in advertising at least persuade you to adopt a sense of lifestyle? Does that make sense? Did you nod your head yes? Tell me more.
Well, the more exposure you have to something, the more you start to perceive it as reality or
As the
normal.
norm? as reality, as the norm. And all of this advertising, one of the things that I can ask you to do, this is your field trip for the weekend, go to a small country like Norway or New Zealand and go into one of their grocery stores and see what they can buy, then come back and spend an hour in Kroger's, right? Our commercial lifestyle, a population of 300 million people in mass media and advertising and all of that, tells us we are in the absolute cornucopia of the world. We can have all kinds of stuff. You go to smaller countries, smaller markets, and it just isn't that way. You want a can of corn? Here it is. I don't like that brand. Then you don't get a can of corn. We were in Spain this summer. You like that brand of tomatoes or you don't. That's it, folks, right? Well, I think that our advertising as a culture, mass-mediated, right? Is news persuasive? Does news tell you where problems are? What's going to happen? Do you begin to predict your behavior based upon this? If you see a rash of stories that point to people having problems in the shopping centers around town, will that affect which shopping centers you go to? Will it even predict whether you go out and go shopping? Will it predict that you go shopping with friends or by yourself? Do you see what I'm getting at? Is that the world around us, interpersonally, organizationally, and mass-mediated communication is a world that is full of persuasion, social influence. And we're sorting through all of that, which then brings me back to my focal point in all of this, because ultimately we're interested in the individual. The point of analysis, the individual. How does that individual sort through all of these messages to make sense? In a sense, no more clever, no more subtle than to try to sort out what is predictably going to be good, what is predictably going to be bad. Because what I'm trying to do as a human animal is to bring to myself as much good as I can find, and good in terms of liking what I like, and avoid that which is negative, has bad consequences, and so forth. So, as a summary, is that the essence of persuasion? You're not sure. All right. Keep thinking about it. Now, tell me this. We're going to talk about interpersonal communication. We're going to divide our chapters into two categories. One is based upon relational quality. One is based upon social cognition, getting to know one another. I will begin class on Tuesday of next week asking you to tell me what differentiates a good relationship from a bad relationship. I will also ask you whether men's definition of that are the same as women's. I will ask you whether you think that a relationship is something that is negotiated. Is a relationship something that is defined? And when I talk about relationship, I'm not talking just about romance, marriage, and so forth. I'm talking about friendships as well, right? Any relationship that we've got out there. Interpersonal communication focuses upon interaction between, typically we limit it to two people. Remember when I talked about the anatomy of communication, I suggested that it was probably better at times to talk about interactants than senders and receivers. In interpersonal communication, are we often sending and receiving simultaneously? Doing something and being perceived simultaneously? So a lot of that kind of stuff goes on. So that's one way to think about it. Is that your homework for the weekend? Go out and get to know somebody? Experience interpersonal communication. Or maybe I should say the opposite. Between now and Tuesday morning, have no interpersonal communication. That's your field experience, right? We'll see you then.